everyone, and welcome to AI. My name is Simon Maghakyan. I'm the program manager at the Armenian Institute. I'm happy to welcome everyone to this very important event about Armenian cultural heritage in Artsakh and its preservation and destruction. We have an absolute superstar panel tonight with Simon Maghakyan, Adam T. Smith, and Avagyan. And I'd like to thank Tatiana Avagyan, AI's trustee, for proposing this event and being very instrumental in putting it together and in the organization. Tatiana will moderate today. She is head of business development for Economist Impact's World Ocean Initiative at the Economist Group. Before I can actually start, let me go through some housekeeping. So this event is being recorded. Therefore, I'll ask everyone to put themselves on mute unless you have to speak at that particular moment. This recording will be uploaded to YouTube. So if you want your faces to be seen, you can keep the camera on. Otherwise, you can switch it off. If you have questions and comments, feel free to leave them in the chat, and we'll go through some of them later. And of course, support AI. Stay tuned for our events. We have a lot of amazing stuff coming up. So follow us on social media, subscribe to our newsletter, and just support us in any way possible. And also just by showing up to our events. So without further ado, Tatiana.
Thank you, Narine, and good evening to all of you, wherever you may be. As many of you know, we postponed this event, which was originally meant to take place on the 21st of September because of the uncertainty following the recent attacks against Armenia the week before that. While the situation is still tense, we felt it was now appropriate to host this event when we're sure, well, things are a little bit calmer now, at least. Today's talk will be looking at preserving Armenian culture in Artsakh and the power of data. So we're all aware of how important data is to help identify challenges and solve them. And in the case of Artsakh, the power of data and information has helped address the challenging media reporting about the war and its aftermath and the current aggressions against Armenia proper now. For some academics, it's helped them raise awareness about the ongoing attempts by Azerbaijan to destroy Armenian culture in the region. In June, the US State Department's annual International Religious Freedom Report on Azerbaijan acknowledged for the first time this destruction of Armenian monuments in Artsakh and Nakhichevan, as well as reported efforts of rebranding Armenian heritage as Caucasian Albanian by the country. With us today to discuss this in more detail is Simon Maghakyan, investigative researcher, Avagyan, executive director of the Heritage Foundation and ex-chair of ICOM Armenia, and Adam T. Smith, distinguished professor of arts and sciences and anthropology at Cornell University and co-director of the Caucasus Heritage Watch. Our three experts will be discussing the significance of the recent reports by the US State Department, as well as the EU Parliament's earlier report, and how we need to engage with external stakeholders to ensure that these attempts don't materialize into a full-blown reality. Welcome to you all. Adam, I'll start with you. You're co-leading the efforts of the Caucasus Heritage Watch. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Sure. Thanks very much for organizing this session. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Caucasus Heritage Watch was formed as a nonpartisan research program centered at both Cornell and Purdue universities in the United States. We were established in 2020 in the wake of the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War in an effort to try to take cultural heritage off of the front lines of conflict. We have two primary areas where we work. The first is historical, where we use archival and reconnaissance imagery and modern commercial satellite data to assess the fate of cultural heritage in the years immediately following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Just last month, we released the results of our first historical study, a 430-page report on the fate of Armenian cultural monuments in Nakhichevan. In the coming months, we will also be releasing our report on the fate of Islamic, Persian, and Azerbaijani heritage in the area of Nagorno-Karabakh in the years after of Armenian administration. The second project we undertake is the more immediate focused one on monitoring cultural heritage at risk. This one focuses on the territories that were ceded to Azerbaijan at the end of the 2020 conflict. And our goal here is to keep eyes regularly on heritage sites that are at risk of their threat being assessed largely through the work of the historical materials that we've worked through that clearly establishes evidence for a continuing threat against Armenian monuments under Azerbaijani administration. And that we just today released our fourth monitoring report based upon a summer round of satellite imaging. In that report, we document one new destroyed site, which is significant because it's the first destroyed site since the International Court of Justice ruling earlier, which I'm sure we'll talk about. We have one other additional damaged site, and unfortunately a historic bridge that looks like it's been impacted. And we have 7 new threatened sites where we see development and earthworks coming really very close to, sometimes right up to the doorstep of threatened historical monuments. So those are the 2 aspects of the project that we've been working on. We have new rounds of monitoring coming in constantly as well.
Thanks. Thank you, Adam. Simon, I mean, you've actively been engaged in highlighting the dangers of cultural destruction in the region. Can you tell us more about some of the initiatives you're involved in and their impact?
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation and for the opportunity to be joined by such esteemed panelists. Just a quick note, a lot of my research into the destruction in Nakhichevan, especially that groundbreaking report we did for Hyperallergic in 2019, was co-authored with Sarah Pickman, who was a former student of Professor Smith. So he has had a huge investment in giving Sarah a chance to become a key player in exposing Azerbaijan's crime. So I wanted to acknowledge that and all the wonderful work that Caucasus Heritage Watch does and the amazing work that Ani does in Yerevan. I mean, in the work that I do with the different organizations that I'll talk about soon, you know, I reach out to her a lot for guidance and for assistance on a lot of projects. So having said that, I would like to highlight some of the internal stakeholders, which I think is important because oftentimes we kind of forget our own agency when it comes to saving our own monuments. Obviously, for me, the number one stakeholder from a variety of perspectives is the Holy See of Mother Echmiadzin when it comes to the religious heritage of Artsakh. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between cultural and religious when Armenian sites are concerned. So I know that there are a lot of efforts by the Holy See in terms of the different regional bodies they have on Artsakh heritage issues that I serve on the one in the West Coast in the US. In fact, we have an upcoming conference that I'm chairing in November in Los Angeles. I know they're doing conferences in Russia, Austria, etc. And I know there's also consideration of some legal routes for establishing, the formality of Echmiadzin's agency when it comes to churches under Azerbaijan's newfound control. Of course, the Republic of Artsakh, or disputed Nagorno-Karabakh, however you want to call it, the people and the government who are there, regardless of their recognition, are the primary stakeholders. And there is a state agency, more commonly known as Artsakh Monuments, on social media that works in this field in terms of raising awareness about what has been lost, but also bringing attention to the monuments that are still under Armenian control and what the best way their preservation could be. And so they engage in community cleanups. That an organization that I'm also involved with, Save Armenian Monuments, I'll tell you a little bit more about it, that helps with those efforts. The Republic of Armenia, despite sort of, not being the most direct party in the Karabakh versus Azerbaijan conflict, at least in in the way that we have positioned that this is an existential issue for Armenians in Artsakh, and the Armenian government is not trying to take away land from Azerbaijan. It's just trying to help people survive and supporting their self-determination. But regardless of that, the Republic of Armenia is also a stakeholder, and we saw them reclaim their agency in the ICJ International Court of Justice case, which I think was a brilliant move for the first time to try to get cultural destruction recognized as racial discrimination, which in itself is unprecedented and opens the door for preservation and protection of monuments beyond sort of the traditional routes of UNESCO, et cetera, that have proven to be ineffective, to say the very least. There's also, of course, the diaspora-based stakeholders. I already mentioned Save Armenian Monuments. It's an Eastern Prelacy initiative. I mentioned the Western Diocese, especially being very active in this. On the academic front, of course, Caucasus Heritage Watch is leading the charge in the visual documentation, and we'll hear more about that. But locally, there's also Monument Watch that I know all of us collaborate with, headed by Dr. Hamlet Bedrosyan, that they use sort of multiple sources of raising awareness about the destruction, and that also includes on-the-ground reporting from locals and also from border areas, because not everything can be seen in satellites. Like the destruction of one of the medieval cemeteries at Parukh that happened earlier this year. Given how small that area was, it's unlikely that that could be observed, but they have, contributed to raising awareness about that. The American University of Armenia recently launched a project as well. And I know there have been occasional reports by non-Armenian organizations like Bellingcat that sort of revolutionized this use of satellites to cover human rights issues, even though arguably it started at AAAS. But Bellingcat is the one that kind of took it to the media. I know they did some reporting during the war, and they're keeping an eye on it. But I just can't stress the importance of what Caucasus Heritage Watch is doing enough in bringing awareness to all of this. And then just very quickly, going back to the idea of being a stakeholder and having agency, and we'll talk more about this probably, but so the biggest lesson of my research through the years is that the pathway to destruction of Armenian monuments is segregation or separation of Armenians from their sacred sites. And so that's something that has to be reversed. And unfortunately, the ICJ's provisional decision did not advance that request for Armenian pilgrimage rights to sacred sites. But I think that should be the overall understanding of ensuring the preservation of Armenian monuments is ensuring Armenian presence at the monuments.
I think that's a very important takeaway, which is that the element of not being present is in itself destruction, and it pulls us away. So you're absolutely right about that. And thank you for that. And also, acknowledging all the different individuals that are party to a lot of the work that you're doing. Ani, we're very honored to have you here because you have a lot of experience working both locally and internationally to promote Armenian heritage. And you're now running the Armenian Heritage Foundation over there. You were the ex-chair of ICOM Armenia. Can you just tell us more about, for those that don't know you, more about the work that you've been doing?
First of all, thank you. Let me to thank Armenian Institute for this initiative. Now it's more important to talk more and more about these issues, and everyone knows that Azerbaijan is putting a lot of effort in propaganda, and actually, unfortunately, on our side, we are not actually committed enough to refrain or stand against whatever we do is not enough. So once again, thanks for this initiative. It's really important, and I hope that it will be continued. And talking about the Armenian Heritage Foundation, Development Foundation, it's the successor of Rokem Center that used to be intergovernmental regional center for the management, enhancement, and protection of cultural heritage. And in the policy and mission and vision of this organization was also the protection in various means of the cultural heritage in general. regardless its geographical location or national origin. Actually, unfortunately, it was a project that was over, but since our team has initiated a number of important initiatives within the center, we have sort of decided to come together and create a foundation that will be the successor and will carry on and take further to the future all projects that were initiated. And one of those projects was the community archaeology and cleaning of the Bariertsi. This year we have collaborated with Simon Maghakyan, and we sort of developed some guidelines for the community, how they should treat the monuments around them. Because despite the geopolitical issues, we have also some threats that are coming from the lack of the knowledge around the communities that live next to the historical sites. And this concerns not only the immovable cultural heritage, but also movable cultural heritage. Unfortunately, we have left behind on the territories of our neighbors also movable cultural heritage. You know that around 12 museums were left behind with their collections in Shushi, Hadrut regions, and Askeran also. So our projects are also aimed at preservation of the Armenian heritage. Actually, I would like to underline a few aspects about the protection of Armenian heritage. Sometimes we sort of historically come to the land level, sort of starting from the beginning. Sometimes it seems that it happens first time when Armenian cultural heritage is targeted and destroyed. But when you look into the history, it happens for several centuries. And in the same manner, like what was 100 years ago on the territory of historical Armenia. We remember the cases when women carried on their shoulders heavy manuscripts to save them to Yerevan from Turkish, or nowadays Turkish part, historical Armenia. I mean, it was always in our genes because we always identify ourselves with our cultural heritage. That is the main documentation about our indigenous, being indigenous in the region. And also we are very much proudful about being talented by nature, creative people. Armenian people gave a lot of stuff to the humanity. So now we are facing really very, very dangerous period in our history. It's a historical time for Armenians because we are squeezed on a little territory where we have been sort of trying to protect our heritage for the last 100 years, more and more. And now today, it's more crucial to think about the mechanism to come together to find solutions how we can go further and protect whatever is left with us, which is the little part of our cultural heritage. So for this, we have initiated, like this month, we are going to organize with ICOM Armenia, actually. Our network includes all main stakeholders in the field of cultural heritage, and we are organizing a training for disaster risk management with ICOM Paris. ICOM is the International Council of Museums next to UNESCO for the museum workers, because we also witness that the museum collections are left behind in Shushi and Hadrut. Most part is left behind, probably also because of lack of some knowledge about at what time, how the things could be saved and evacuated. If I have some time, I would like to tell you about another project implemented this year, a few words just about the intangible cultural heritage, because as Simon also mentioned, the cultural heritage is treated more when people leave the territory where they practice, where they use this cultural heritage. So this year we had a project with the University of Saga in Japan for the research and documentation of carpet weaving and embroidery that was developed in Hadrut. Actually, everyone knows that Hadrut was one of those unique territories populated by Armenians that at least for 100 years, for 300 years, constantly was populated only by Armenians. This was one of the rare places where you could see like houses of 300 years old, which is also a cultural architectural environment. Unfortunately, this region is also threatened now and could be destroyed. So we have interviewed people from Hadrut who moved to live on the territory of Republic of Armenia. There were films recorded when they tell about the embroidery, the patterns they used, the symbolism they used, taken from the nature around. And also the environmental protection is very important in the context of movable cultural heritage. So there are many projects we are implementing. As I've said before, the main objective is the protection and preservation, but it's not enough, and we really need to consolidate our efforts all together. There are many groups doing things, but I think that there is a system needed to be sort of inserted in the field to use the efforts efficiently, not to repeat some things, and be more efficient in putting our efforts. Thank you.
I mean, it sounds like you know, the cross collaboration that goes on between individuals like Simon and yourself and others locally and internationally is kind of developing a roadmap for that. But I mean, one of the things, and Simon, maybe you can talk a little bit about this, was straight after the war ended, that there seemed to be a sort of a chaotic process of trying to gather as much information about all the different religious and cultural sites. And there were a lot of multiple efforts being undertaken by various different people in the diaspora and of course in Armenia. When you were working on Nakhichevan, and you did, you know, that report was so significant, I think, for so many people outside of our bubble who know nothing about the region. But when this happened, when it happened, you know, when we saw what had happened with the war, and we saw the destruction of the cathedral, we were ringing the alarm bells, but very few people were listening. Why is that? Like, why is that alarm bell not sort of ringing loud enough for the international community?
Well, that's the $1 million question, but I tend to sort of be more practical about those things. I think a lot of the media reporting comes in waves. You know, we saw a wave of coverage of the issue of cultural monuments right after the November 22 ceasefire. You know, it basically was at least somewhat of a headline in sort of a cultural section in many major newspapers across the world. So we saw that wave, but then it dwindled down. I mean, there was, you know, a wave of also coverage after, you know, the first report came out on Nakhichevan, but I don't know if we should expect there to be sort of continuous coverage. I think the more important thing is that the narrative reflects the realities on the ground. Otherwise, there's really no chance of solving these problems if we are engaged in narrative wars. And I think we have managed to set the right narrative. I mean, in 2019, the Nakhichevan's The Truth came out, recently Adam and their Caucasus Heritage team sort of nuke-proofed that research, and they're I think the narrative, and now they're adding more to the sort of nuances of that yes, Armenians also damaged monuments in Nagorno-Karabakh, but it was failed upkeep. It was not sort of state-sponsored erasure. I think that's probably more important in the long term. And sometimes if something is documented, does not get picked up right away. Like I collaborated with Caucasus Heritage Watch for an investigation for the Art newspaper that talked about, that was funded by the AGBU, that talked about the churches of Agulis, right? That didn't get big reviews in top newspapers, but then it was cited in the State Department report. So I think that we should not just expect sort of immediate coverage. We should look at the long term. However, to go back to your point, Tatiana, I think there is there is another very specific reason that has to do with reporters on the ground. So if major newspapers don't have reporters on the ground, they either have to follow sort of the big wires, and in turn, those big wires often just follow State Department press releases, not because they work for the U.S. State Department, but because that's where they have their major source of information. And I'm saying this because a few times when I've pitched ideas, the response has been, "Are you based in Armenia?" Or if you're going to go there, how are you going to pay for it, because we're unable to pay ourselves. So I think it's a mixed picture, but I don't think, we're probably the top victim when it comes to the erasure of our culture, but I don't see ourselves as being victimized by the media narrative anymore. I think we are past that point.
But do you think that the lack of information from our end and recording of information is hindering that effort to communicate what's really happening on the ground?
I don't think there is not enough information. I think everything is being presented in sufficient ways. If there is interest on behalf of a media outlet, I think they have a chance to cover as much as possible. If the hint is that Armenia isn't doing enough, sure, if it was a better organized state with stronger institutions that actually both truly cared about cultural preservation, that I don't think is really truly the case, that we might have had a different picture. And then I think in the beginning of your question, you were alluding to sort of some of the rescue operations that happened after the war. I know Azerbaijan, may try to have a legal claim that those are cultural artifacts under their sovereignty, but I doubt they would want any of the khachkars, because now they're declaring all the khachkars artificially aged fakes. Yeah. Right. And so, that one in particular could be an issue that, if the Armenian government or the Armenian church wanted to highlight, maybe some more media coverage would come out of that. But I just don't think this issue should have like a media plan. It should all be about doing the research. And even if the research does not get noticed today, we will see its impact in the short term, in the midterm, and definitely in the long term. Now, there are some occasions, for example, Getty just put out a book on cultural destruction. There are some occasions that Armenian erasure gets erased from some mainstream publications, but I think that's a time to call them out. And I'm actually, I looked at the report. The foreword is written by none other than Irina Bokova, the former chief of UNESCO that was a key player in the cover-up of Nakhichevan's erasure. So, things like this will keep happening, and it's, upon us to do that. There is no central system. These are all sort of individual efforts. On my end, it's been mostly a volunteer effort, which is really hard financially, but at the same time, it gives me flexibility to say and write whatever I do without, being afraid of how sponsors or governments or institutions are going to react to my truth telling. So sorry, I went on a rant.
No, that's the kind of answer I was looking for, actually. And I guess it leads to my question to Adam about the reports that Caucasus Heritage Watch have published, and one of most recently, I think it was actually last month. And you've clearly been able to demonstrate the gradual destruction of Armenian heritage in the region. Can you tell us more about the significance of cultural erasure in the Caucasus compared with other historical cases?
Sure. Let me, I'd like to pick up on a thread that Simon actually offered, because I think he's absolutely right about the larger mediascape. And then I'll turn to the Nakhichevan work that we continued off of Simon's own work with Sarah. So I have my thought on why this doesn't get as much traction is also based upon what we actually do. I think that there's such a toxic atmosphere around the conflict that a lot of media is scared. And they're very trepidatious about wading into a conflict where they don't know enough to know whether they're making a mistake. And so the only solution that I think our group can think of to help assist to that is provide facts. So there's so much opinion and there's so much, so many hot takes on social media in particular, but elsewhere as well, that the best thing that I think we can do to help base the conversation and ground it in reality is provide fact. And so that's sort of what Caucasus Heritage Watch is really committed to, is you can have your opinions, you can have your ideas about what needs to come, but we have to begin with a grounding in shared facts. And if we can do that, then the conversation takes on the air of reality as opposed to sort of vilification and unreality where it is now. Now, in terms of what we were documenting in Nakhichevan and providing sort of the satellite imagery to provide the, like Simon said, sort of the nuclear version or nuke proof, I think you said, Simon, the discussion in his own reporting. There, I think what we see is something truly worrying about the fate of cultural heritage globally, not just in this particular area. I think what we see there is a situation where we have a form of cultural erasure that is potentially a threat to a vast trove of humanities heritage globally, if this model were to actually leak outward to other authoritarian states. And I think there is some preliminary evidence that perhaps it is. What we typically think of as cultural heritage destruction, at least since say 2000 or so, is the kind of spectacular destructions of the Bamiyan Buddhas by the Taliban, or we think of ISIS and its highly media formed displays of heritage destruction. But what we see in Nakhichevan is in many ways the antithesis of that approach to cultural erasure. Instead of being opportunistic, where it's bombing something that just happens to come within your territory, this is actually total and complete. Instead of being spectacular, it's done silently with a cloak of secrecy all around it. And so the kinds of silent erasure that we saw in Nakhichevan between 1997 and 2011 are roughly the windows that the satellite imagery provide for us, is I think a worrying new development in heritage, the field of heritage preservation, and one that practitioners really need to be attentive to, because our institutions for protecting cultural heritage are largely national institutions. And so what happens when it's the nation that's failing to protect, that creates new terrain for where heritage preservation needs to turn. And so we've already mentioned the case in the International Court of Justice, which I think is truly monumental and really does open an important new element in heritage protection. But there again, it's also nation-based, because if Armenia didn't sue for protection of monuments within the territory of Azerbaijan, there would have been no standing. If Armenia didn't have a state, there's no standing. So you can imagine Uyghurs who don't have an independent state not having the same kind of standing in the ICJ. So the other element that strikes me as a potentially heartening development in heritage preservation is the intervention of the International Criminal Court into areas of heritage preservation, and the successful prosecution of an individual from Mali in 2015 who was given 9 years in prison for destruction and damage to tombs around Timbuktu. This is a big deal, and to my mind, it also creates a need for greater alliances between heritage folks, archaeologists, and lawyers who can begin to build the kinds of cases that can provide some kind of punitive sanctions to those who are directly responsible for destruction of heritage sites. So those, I think, are two institutions that have asserted jurisdiction over heritage only in recent years, and that is an interesting and exciting trend to follow.
Thanks for that, Adam. Ani, I mean, just kind of building up on what what Simon and Adam were talking about, and just about how you're communicating, you know, from the ground about the reported destructions to the international stakeholders. How different is it to the times before when you worked for ICOM Armenia?
Well, that's a good question, because talking from my experience with the international organizations, by the way, it's not always necessary to provide for the provided data to be broadcasted. Very often you provide the data, you provide the objective information, but for some political, geopolitical reasons or other reasons, it's not broadcasted. I have been involved in discussions during the annual meetings in ICOM headquarters in Paris, that is located in the in UNESCO headquarters, and I've witnessed how the hard topics, and also Adam mentioned that those which are less known to people, they frighten them. Or just trying to avoid the conflict, they simply put the things aside. How they simply don't develop the discussion. There were several cases concerning to various aspects of cultural heritage discussions. One was really before the anniversary, before the 2015, the anniversary of the genocide, when our German colleague suggested a topic for the Museum International Day that was related to Armenian genocide, Holocaust, Gulag, and other human disasters that took place during the recent times, and how this was banned, or how the backstage lobbying worked to sort of change things by the delegations from Turkey and Azerbaijan. Of course, we were really strong, and it was mitigated to sort of bring the balance. And what I want to say that international organizations try to be democratic, and they try to share the equality between the delegations, between their members, and they try to be nice to everybody. But it's some, well, very often it's not objective, really. So ICOM really was very supportive also during the wartime. I mean, they reacted to our calls immediately. But again, if you look into the statements that they published during the war, they were really balanced, like those that were published by other international organizations in the field of cultural heritage, calling all parties to protect the cultural heritage. I like this idea very much, because cultural heritage doesn't know nations. It's the memory of humanity. We should be everyone should be committed to protection of the cultural heritage, regardless its origin. This is my understanding, and I build all my work on this idea. And Armenian heritage is particularly threatened because it's always under threat of neighboring nations who are brought up, educated since the moment they understand themselves to hate Armenians, to commit their lives for the erasure of Armenian nation, because they have like sort of political desire of creating pan-Turkic country. So, I mean, this makes really complicated the situation. And in this context, any international organizations, any international documents are powerless when people are filled with hatred against each other. So and they aim to destroy, erase anything. I think we need to work on educational level to teach our kids more about morality, about the high values, to teach them that regardless any interests in your life, cultural heritage is important. What is preserved in museums, it doesn't matter, it's I don't know, it's Russian, it's Ukrainian, it's Armenian, it's Turkish, it's a value created at some moment by humans. It's needed to be protected. It's our responsibility of generations to pass to each other. So I think that the curriculum for our generation should be to develop a sort of strategy for the protection of cultural heritage and to execute it starting from the individual level to every institutional level. So this means that we should start from communicating about the importance of the cultural heritage, because we witness the lack of knowledge, first of all, within the, I think if people understand how important is this church or that mosque or that museum object, they would never think about destruction, regardless the hatred they have.
Well, I guess it's also the thing that we think of our culture. We're not always thinking about the other culture. Simon and Adam, actually, this is a question for both of you, and it's related to to the reports and to the documentation of all of this. How is it helping the both sides of the media narrative that we see? I know we've touched on it slightly, but how is it supporting or helping that, in the absence of having a national institution that is able to support and back up the kind of work that, Caucasus Heritage Watch is doing? And how much of this kind of work and these reports, how can they inform policymakers on what steps are needed to ensure that the region's history is preserved, on both sides?
Simon, you want to go first? Why don't you go ahead? Okay, well, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think I said everything that there was, I had to say on the topic earlier. So if you want to take this.
Sure. So, I think there's two threads to your question, Tatiana. One is the thread about how do we use the kinds of facts that we put together through reporting to try to affect real positive change for heritage monuments. And for that, I think the global institutions like ICJ and ICC do offer some hope. And our CHW reports have been part of that as well. Simon's reporting has been part of the European Union's deliberations on heritage in the Caucasus as well, which is all very positive. I think, though, that one of the key problems here is that we are stuck in a 20th century narrative of heritage being the province of the nation state. And so when nation states go to war, heritage goes on the front lines. How we can affect a larger change of that, I like the way that Ani's talking about it and thinking about heritage as a bequest of humanity, and that if we can pry heritage away from the nation state, it's going to be difficult, and it's going to involve changing narratives, and it's going to involve finding new institutions, because UNESCO is not going to be the one that allows us to pry heritage away from the grips of the nation state. But it's only when we actually can recognize the heritage of the other as fundamental to telling the human story as our own that we really begin to have real possibilities of change. Here, I think this is what's most deeply worrying about the both sidism you referenced in your question in the social media narrative in particular, where we see it. This strikes me as a massive failure of moral reasoning on the part of the belligerents in the conflict. The both sidism is the inversion of the traditional golden rule, which would be do unto others as you would do unto them. This seems to now believe do unto others because they did the same thing unto you. This is a collapse of moral reasoning of epic proportions, and it's very disturbing. If we can re-inject humanity into the conversation, and reclaim a moral sphere where we actually understand that moral reasoning is predicated upon how we treat others, not how we treat ourselves. That strikes me as a vital case, not only in the Caucasus, but also in the way in which heritage is being brought into the front lines of conflicts in Ukraine and China and elsewhere.
Thank you, Adam. Simon, I'm not gonna follow up with you because you've already you were fine with that, but I do want to actually bring up something that Ani I think sort of alluded to and mentioned, which is about sort of each community sort of understanding, appreciating, valuing each other's culture. And Ani, I want to hear from you about how important this is, you know, the steps that are needed to be taken. What kind of efforts are you seeing in Armenia to help with this? Because this, you know, will this help with reconciliation efforts? Is reconciliation through shared culture something that you see happening, or is this something in the distant future that we should be aiming for?
Well, thanks for that question. That's close, very, very close to my heart. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay,
I can hear you.
great. So communities sharing the values of each other's cultural heritage. I mean, if we look into the history, especially of European countries, some of those countries have been in long-term conflicts, like 100 years of fightings, blood, and destruction. But today we see them in harmony, appreciating each other's cultural heritage, supporting, helping, and living together in harmony. Of course, knowing about this background history. I mean, of course, maybe you may say that there is no comparison between the region and Europe. But I do hope that if there is a common understanding and the will to live together in the region, the states and the communities can find ways. I mean, not on the level of this generation. I don't want to be really sort of too banal to say that this generation can forgive the old destruction, the old pain reached to each other. But if we understand that we want our future generations to live in harmony and peace, we need to start to work today. I mean, we are even too late. But if we look in the manner of Armenians around the heritage of others, as Simon earlier mentioned, Armenians appreciating, creating cultural heritage, they know the value of cultural heritage. They never destroy any cultural heritage. I mean, you may say there are some examples based on like personal, psychological, or I don't know, some personal aspects, but it's not a massive, planned, deliberate destruction of cultural heritage, which is implemented by some of our neighboring countries on state and individual levels. It's hard to find any Azerbaijani who doesn't want to destroy Armenian heritage, who doesn't want to kill an Armenian. This is a problem. I mean, on the side of Armenians, I think we are much more forward in this direction. In terms of, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but there is a lot of work to be done together. I do hope that one day the politics will be not prioritized more than human values, because this is something that differs humankind from the rest of the natural world. And we can find common lines to live together in the region in peace and prosperity, as we can see something happened in Europe in several centuries. But maybe I don't know, maybe I sound really very
no, I think
Maybe it doesn't sound realistic, taking in account the current, but this is sort of wish and dream of someone who lives in a region with the conflict that appears. I want my kids to live in a peace and harmony, to create and to develop. I don't want them to think about war, about protection, about anything related to killing and something not human. So this, I mean, if everyone lives with this desire, we can find a common sense to develop together for the future in the peace.
Simon, I think you wanted to chime in.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Ani and Adam are saying. I just want to open the bracket slightly more. Certainly agree that we need to depoliticize sacred sites. And, I think Ani mentioned sort of the Armenian connection with cultural monuments throughout history. In some ways, I think there was an overcompensation for being occupied and oppressed. And so with our cultural monuments is the only place I think that we felt a sense of autonomy, a sense of, having our human dignity respected and recognized. So there is that very, very special connection that Armenians have with their sacred sites that not every nation has, given their history. At the same time, I think there has been a politicization of cultural monuments, and this started really with de-Stalinization and maybe earlier with the nationalization that happened in the Soviet Union, where sort of cultural monuments in titular republics were sort of assigned to the states that now have inherited them, and there was this among Armenians and Georgians and Azerbaijanis, this sort of competition of who can come on top in terms of their cultural past. And obviously, Armenians and Georgians have a much longer presence in the region than Azerbaijanis, and I think this kind of put Azerbaijanis in a situation where if they wanted to sort of play that game, revisionism was the sort of only choice that they had. And the times have changed. There's 3 scholarship for media in Armenia, but I think sometimes there's also sort of narratives that are seen as whether they sort of are patriotic or not. But I have observed, among almost every stakeholder that I mentioned, that professionalism and scholarship has become sort of the approach to unite around, as opposed to, we're not doing this because we're patriots. We're doing this because this is good ultimately for everyone in the region. And depoliticizing monuments is one thing, but also acknowledging that even if modern Azerbaijanis may not have direct, specific connections to certain Islamic monuments on their territory or in the Caucasus in general, I think we need to at the very least acknowledge that these sites are sacred to them, and no one gets to decide if a church or a mosque is sacred in good faith to one people or another. And I say this because, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, our best path of saving whatever monuments have survived is ensuring Armenian presence at those sites, regardless of the sovereignty that the cultural and religious sites are part of. And I think that approach might be a helpful way of talking about cultural heritage and sacredness in the region.
That's really well said. I'm going to open this up to some questions from the audience. Feel free to raise your hand. Felix, go ahead. Your hand was up first.
I'd like to start with a few controversial remarks, if I may. Firstly, clearly the situation over Armenian monuments in Azerbaijan and Azerbaijani monuments in Armenia is nothing new. If you go to the western parts of Poland, the lands that some people call the recovered territories or recovered lands, and other people think is German land, which was nicked by the Poles after the Second World War. You go into old churches and you see monuments in German, and they were Lutheran churches, and they were just grabbed up by the Catholics after the Second World War, the Polish Catholics. Populations change, populations get kicked out, and new people come in. They just take over what they find. And sometimes they try to erase the entire history or ethnic background of a monument. Sometimes they don't, but they just carry on using it as they see fit. So Armenians, Azerbaijanis are not unique in this. It happens everywhere. Even the Brits did it in lots of colonial situations. The other thing is coming out quite strongly is an understanding that Armenia and the people of Armenia should do something to recognize the Azerbaijani monuments on its territory. Unfortunately, because of the academic wars from the 60s, 70s, 1960s, 1970s, where warring scholars from each side tried to prove that the other side was making everything up and that the nations didn't really exist and they didn't have the right to live there. I think both sides were guilty of that, and the Georgians as well. There is so much rhetoric, or maybe it's not spoken, that Azerbaijanis never really had any right to live in what is now Armenia. Well, Yerevan was basically a mainly Azerbaijani city at the beginning of the 20th century. So what, sorry, you want me to wrap up?
I wanted to ask the question.
Yeah, well, I'm just going to say that I think it would be a very good idea if the Armenian, either the government or some NGOs, produced an accurate record of the Azerbaijani monuments that survive in Armenia, because there are some, and people perhaps don't know about them. I don't know very much about them. I mean, many of them were destroyed after the Azerbaijanis were kicked out, but there are some there, and an honest, accurate assessment of what is there without evaluating whether it's important, whether it's ancient, whether it's modern, whether it's significant, whether it's rubbish, just to assess what is there and to show that Armenians are prepared to acknowledge, frankly, what survives, how what was destroyed, and just put it out there as facts, as Adam mentioned earlier. I think that would set a very good template for any action over the way that Armenian monuments are treated in Azerbaijan. Thank you. Sorry to rabbit on.
No, thank you, Felix. Adam, you've already published one report, but there's another one coming out. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that.
Sure, I don't want to get ahead of us, but probably in either January or February, we're going to be releasing a comprehensive study, much like a partner of the one we did for Nakhichevan, which looks at the Islamic, the Persian, and the Azerbaijani heritage that was within the areas of Nagorno-Karabakh that were for 30 years under Armenian administration. And what I can tell you, and we've already reported on this in preliminary findings, is that it looks very different. Like Ani mentioned, one can look at basically the pie charts that we will provide. The pie charts for our Nakhichevan report are pie charts that show total cultural erasure of the kind that could only have been undertaken by a systematic bureaucratic state-sponsored initiative. What we see in the pie charts for the fate of heritage in Nagorno-Karabakh is very different. It's some things were damaged, some things were destroyed, but a lot survived. And a lot not only survived, it actually survived amidst ruins. So one of the things that's often interesting is you look at a village in Nagorno-Karabakh from the skies, and you see a ruined village, abandoned village, and the only one structure standing is the mosque. This speaks to a much more complicated situation as to what was happening on the ground within Nagorno-Karabakh. And I don't believe that it necessarily articulates with a very different cultural value accorded to heritage. What I do think I can say is that it accords to a very different state position as opposed in relationship to heritage. and that the political authorities did not undertake a systematic campaign of erasure in Nagorno-Karabakh, as was done in Nakhichevan. That this is another way of combating what, and in some ways, Felix, you're coming back to the both sidesism, like they both did it, and that basically ends you in a very distinct moral quandary, when that's actually not true. What the important thing is, as you say, is putting a fact together. And there's a very big difference what happens. And once you establish the fact basis of the difference, you can then debate about what is to be done about it. But I think you're right that we need more facts, and that's one reason why we are undertaking this study.
If I, excuse me, if I may jump in. Yeah, I totally agree with what was just said. And to add more to that, in case this is not clear, none of this research shows that Azerbaijanis, as ordinary people, are more or less likely to destroy Armenian monuments, vice versa. In fact, the destruction that happened in Nakhichevan was carried out, by the political elites, with assistance from state scholars and the armed forces. There is absolutely no data that shows there was any popular support, and so this was, not really even a populist action. And there's several reasons for that. One being that for 50 years, as Felix, you said, the historiography that, was claiming monuments as their own. For 50 years, the Azerbaijanis of Nakhichevan were told that the churches, the khachkars, the Christian gravestones were proto-Azerbaijani through Caucasian Albanians. Regardless how ridiculous that theory is, a lot of people in Nakhichevan actually bought into it. And those who did not, either, still like the monuments because they were Armenian, or still maybe had some resentment, but there's really very little evidence that we're talking about sort of individual acts of vandalism that are more or less in one population or another. It was really a state sponsored effort that, had, of course, sort of an ethnic conflict as the center of all of that, but there were so many political triggers that happened. I mean, some might say, and Avagyan, who is the legendary researcher who created this amazing baseline imagery database for the monuments of Nakhichevan, I mean, he always knew that they would be destroyed. He just did not know when. And one of the reasons why it might have started in 1997 is because there was a major year in realignment in the post-Soviet world, where certain countries chose certain poles, and that's when Russia and Armenia became closer. At that time, things have changed, and Azerbaijan and Turkey became much closer. Same with the last phase of the destruction in 2005. Of course, Heydar Aliyev always wanted to outshine his father, but there were other triggers in late 2005 when they gave the order for the final erasure, among them being the launch of the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline that gave Azerbaijan the influence to get a green light from UNESCO to proceed, and maybe some other things, not just that geopolitical transformation. And Azerbaijan might have been also angry with Turkey that in 2005 chose sort of this token preservation propaganda of repairing Akhtamar that Azerbaijan heavily disagreed with. So I just wanted to clarify that if this is not Azerbaijanis are better or worse than Armenians, vice versa. This is about governments and regimes, authoritarian regimes that use cultural destruction for a variety of purposes, including power projection, that I think Adam referenced earlier, that even, this was done silently. Yeah, so they were not trying to shock the conscious like ISIS was doing, but it was still a power projection that's very much in line with, an authoritarian regime's behavior. And just one last thing, in late 2005 and 2006, as they carried out the last sort of phase of the erasure that might have lasted as late, I don't know, a few years later, because the final report did not come out until 2008. But as the destruction of Armenian monuments was happening in Nakhichevan in the last phase, they're also shutting down every single tea house that were public spaces that people could have political ideas exchange. So this was going on in line with that. And I promise that will be my last one, but I want to mention one more thing. I don't know the extent of this happening, but I am familiar with accounts where ordinary Azerbaijanis in Nakhichevan passively resisted the destruction by burying some of the Armenian tombstones in their backyards, etc., while pretending to cooperate with the regime. So, there's also resistance we have seen, and obviously the biggest one coming from Akram Aylisti, thanks to whom we know so much more about the destruction, especially how it started. Sorry for the long answer.
No, thank you, Simon. And I think, this kind of destruction is the last frontier in sort of removing what we know as history and what we can gather as information that tells us about the past. I want to see if there are any other questions, because we are coming up to time. Please raise your hand if you've got questions for our panelists. Felix, I may hold you back just because there might be someone else who wants to ask a question. Well, yeah, go ahead if you want, but you'll have to keep it short because we are short on time.
Thank you. I'm grateful. Just Adam, just picking up on your point. I'm not saying, a report or an analysis of what remains of Azerbaijani culture in Armenia, I don't think should be done because people want to prove that aren't those Azerbaijanis horrible, and maybe a little bit of destruction took place in Armenia, but there's tons of destruction in Azerbaijan. I think it should be done in and of itself so that Azerbaijani people can see that there is or should develop some respect for what remains of Azerbaijani culture and monuments in Armenia itself, and should not be a comparative thing, but should just set a good precedent by doing some good work in Armenia and hopefully show people that it is possible, as Simon says, to depoliticize monuments, to show, look, this is what is actually still there of your culture.
I think one thing that I think would be highly valuable in what you're talking about, Felix, is anything that can point to the long and durable cosmopolitan history of the Caucasus is a good thing. The emergence of highly segregated nation-based communities is a new thing. I'm an archaeologist, so anything that's since the Bronze Age is a new thing for me. But that's a new thing. And so I think anything that can help document the incredibly cosmopolitan past of this region is a good thing. And anything that can also help remind people that there used to be villages next door that were villages and houses next door of people who weren't identical to me and who I live with in perfect peace. I think that Ami is right in thinking that reconciliation is a ways away, but one can never begin too early to lay the foundations for thinking about one's neighbor and thinking about others, and laying that groundwork for generations in the future is always something worthwhile. And if heritage can play a role in making that possible, then I think that that's a very good thing to do.
If I may add a remark to what Felix is raising, I think the best evidence about what you are raising are the cemeteries of Azerbaijanis who lived before 1990 in Armenia. You can simply come to Armenia and visit these cemeteries and see in which shape are those which are not touched. And when cemeteries are there, it's something telling about the people living next to it, about the values, and controversially, the other ways of destruction are happening on the other side. I mean, this is a very important indicator to how the neighbor's heritage is treated or not touched in the other territories, countries. So I simply invite you to Armenia to come and see this Azerbaijani heritage that you are talking about, in which some heritage, like the Blue Mosque in Yerevan that you have mentioned, that Yerevan is Azerbaijani city, is Persian mosque. But again, the propaganda that I've mentioned in the first part of my talk is changing the information, and what you are talking about is the classical proof of what is being distributed by Azerbaijani side. So I think the easiest way is just to visit the countries and to see in practice what's happening there. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I think this is an important question to raise and talk about, to express our ideas. The truth is coming during the discussion. Thank you.
That's true. Thank you, Annie, for that. And Adam, if you'd like to share a link to one of your more recent reports, please feel free to do that on the chat. And I can see that Narina has also provided links to our feedback form, and of course a link to our donation page. AI is a charity. We are registered in the UK, and all our work is made possible through sort of important funding that comes from our supporters and friends and certain institutions. So thank you in advance. I just want to end with a quote, because I saw it at the end of a really beautiful movie I watched the other day, and it's by the Uruguayan writer Eduardo Galeano. And it says, "No history is mute. No matter how much they own it, break it, and lie about it, human history refuses to shut its mouth. Despite deafness and ignorance, the time that was continues to tick inside the time that is." I thought that was a beautiful quote that I wanted to share with you all. I want to thank our speakers, Simon, Adam, and Annie, for taking the time. Annie, I appreciate it's very late for you, but really appreciate all three of you participating on this panel, and for the thoughtful questions as well, Felix. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I think it's time to wrap up. So thanks for this amazing, insightful, and difficult conversation. There are difficult and painful topics we absolutely have to talk about. This is one of them. Thanks for being with us. To our audience, we appreciate this, and without our audience, none of these efforts actually make any sense. So thanks for coming to our events and supporting us. Thank you, Adam, Simon, Annie, and Tatiana, for making this conversation very insightful. And as you've seen in the chat, there are these two links. One is the feedback form, as Tatiana said. Please take your time, it's literally 1 minute maybe, to share your opinions with us, to give us maybe your preferences, what kind of events would you like to see, whether you enjoyed this or not, what could be changed, maybe something about the format, whatever you have to share with us. And the other link, as Tatiana said, is to support us. Any support is important. Coming to our events, donating, sharing information, subscribing to our newsletter, following us on social media, and just anything you can do for us. Everything is appreciated. Thank you very much, guys. I think, we can wrap up and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you.